Good afternoon. I'm speaking with my former student, William Leahy, who spent some time in Moscow, Russia, studying at the country's top diplomatic school. Hi, William. How are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you, Dr. Tarosian?
I'm doing well, thank you. This is a nice summer day in Oneonta, and I'm glad that you're back home in Oneonta. So tell me about your studies and your career at the moment.
At the moment, or do you want to hear about the Russia? Because that's led to where I am at the moment. But currently, I'm enrolled at Cornell University for a master's degree there, so I will start that later August. That's been keeping me busy with all the paperwork that they need and require, stuff like that.
I'm
Bef
happy to hear that, William, because the last time we spoke, you were undecided between or among different paths
yeah,
that you could take, and all of them seemed great, but I'm happy that you're staying in upstate New York. Go on.
yeah. But I guess in terms of the background for the Russia stuff is it started with you first started to teach me Russian before I studied abroad in St. Petersburg State University, and I went there for a year, but COVID had cut that short in March 2020 that's when COVID started. And so I decided to go back and enrolled at MGIMO, one of Russia's top schools. It's where all their political elite come from. And so I did a master's program there that was jointly run with the United Nations. And after that master's program, I worked for the United Nations and so on. And then I wanted to go back to Russia still. It's a fun, entertaining, interesting place. So I went back as an English teacher, ended up hating it, was a total waste of time, no other way to put it. So then I did another volunteer program with the United Nations and enrolled in Cornell. I guess the way that I frame it or speak about it makes it sound a little more kind of lolly dolly, like I'm jumping around as I want, but
I'll just
it's
make a
yeah.
small comment about Cornell. You seem to be joining a lot of your family members as a Cornellian, but that's on a side note that does
Well,
relate to Russia.
yeah, most of my family members were in the vet school there. Actually, I think nearly all of them at some point ended up in the veterinary program there, as you know, because you've met John and Dad, who are both veterinarians.
I met your dad, and I know your grandpa was also a vet, and he
Hmm.
started the tradition. But I'm glad that you're doing something different. Not that I don't like vets, because I do respect them as long as we depend on them for our pets' health. We drive to Cornell for that. But I wanted to congratulate you on your choice. And earlier, when you chose the top diplomatic school, MGIMO, the Moscow State um, University for International Relations. I think that's how you translate that, international relations,
Yeah,
or
it's Moscow State Institute of International Relations.
yeah. And in Russian, it sounds mgimo, as you said, but when I was growing up, we just said mimo because we skipped the state part, the g,
Mhm.
государственный, and we just said mimo. If I were to say to my parents that I want to go there to study, they said you would just go mima. Mima means
Mhm.
you miss it. You wouldn't get in because it was really nearly impossible to get in. You had to be somebody whose family was an apparatchik family or top communist party leader, at least very, very smart and very well connected. But you got in, and that was a miracle in itself. And that speaks of the opening of the borders, I guess. How do you feel about getting into MGIMO?
Well, I would say that when you're applying to master's programs, the applications are different. And two, applying as a foreigner, I would say we did have an easier chance. It was not as competitive as for say the Russians. I believe that their bachelor's programs are around a 1% acceptance rate. It's partially because MGIMO itself is an incredibly small school. It's 8,000 students total. And then it's also incredibly selective. In terms of applying to it, it was actually a choice between MGIMO and then the newer big name school of Moscow, Higher School of Economics.
Vishka. Vishka, as they say, where Barack Obama went to visit when he was
Hmm.
president.
Yeah, they're considered the more liberal, or they used to be considered the more liberal school. But no, in terms of the application, there was nothing inherently complex to it. I had great grades from SUNY Oneonta. I had already been to Russia, so I was confident when I applied to MGIMO. But if you apply as a foreigner, just your status as a foreigner does give you somewhat of an easier application, somewhat in terms of how they view it. Because the programs that we are in, like the one that's jointly run with the United Nations, is targeted to attract foreign students. And I believe the acceptance rate was around 50% for the people that apply to it. So I don't think there was anything overly special or complex to the application process itself,
I
other
was
than the fact that it's Russia, so they just require a ridiculous amount of documents stamped and sealed and all of that, as you know. It's not official in Russia if it doesn't have some random stamp on it. So that was a pain in the butt, I guess.
as the old joke goes, your dog's passport.
Hmm.
How's your Russian language, by the way? I'm not going to brag about our tutoring sessions together because those were very initial. And I know you were a great student because all you did was homework. I caught you at the library. Like I would catch other students outdoors, at bars. I would catch you studying at the library, and that's what you did. So I'm hoping that people who hear this, and especially students who hear this, would be encouraged by your example. How is your Russian now?
I would say my Russian's decent. It's enough that I get around without any issue in Russia. Things like political discussion or stuff that would be require very in-depth knowledge of the vocabulary would be harder for me to do. I do practice it 3, 4 times a week with a Russian for 30 minutes to an hour. I'm still learning the vocabulary and stuff, but I wouldn't say I grind it at all or, spend a lot of time on it. It's kind of just something I slowly chip away at. And now that I'm out of Russia, there's a little less motivation to still work on it as I go through.
It was a big topic, and there were departments for Russian studies, for the language studies during the Cold War and right after it.
Hmm.
Then for a long period of time, Russia was just another country. And now again, we may see more interest, and that's because of all the conflict that's happening there. So I know that you spent some time in Kiev before going to Moscow. You spent some time in Ukraine because of COVID and travel restrictions. What was your impression on Ukraine at that time? Do you remember?
No, I did enjoy Ukraine. So I and another MGIMO student, another American who was in the same program as me, we went there because it was open, it was Russian speaking, and this was during COVID, all the border shutdowns. I personally liked the city of Kiev. It was reminiscent to just that of like St. Petersburg, a mix of Petersburg and Moscow and how it felt, but it was a nice city. It had all the things you'd expect, I guess, in an old Slavic city, old churches and old palaces, and then stuff that's not exactly as nice, poor districts with Khrushchevkas on the other side of the river.
Mm.
But it was a very fun time in Kiev.
So did you sense any attitude towards Russia or Russians? Because Ukrainians and Russians are closely related ethnically. They speak very similar languages, and I would dare say that every Russian has a cousin in Ukraine and vice versa. How did you feel about the relationship between the two countries or cultures?
See, when we were there, tensions were not exactly as bad as they are now. There was, of course, some animosity regarding Crimea. The war in Donbass was the stalemate, or not so much stalemate, but it was kind of just a conflict in Donbass. It wasn't the full-blown war it was now. In general, the attitudes varied a lot. You had people who openly identified themselves as ethnically Russian but born in Ukraine, and then you have the others who only spoke Ukrainian from Western Ukraine. So it didn't affect interactions or anything like that that much, and you didn't experience any hatred for Russians towards Ukrainians at the time or Ukrainians towards Russians at the time, simply because the conflict was in a lull, so to say. Let me think. I mean, a lot of Ukrainians that we did meet, they would identify as Ukrainian, but their first language was Russian. They were born speaking Russian and they were ethnically Russian, but they still identified as Ukrainian. And I guess that's part of the issue that's creating the conflict today is what is the identity of Ukraine?
I see. And let's talk about the conflict itself. So you very appropriately reminded our listeners, our viewers, that the conflict started before, not just in 2022, not on February 24th, but and back in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea. We're not going to give a history lesson here, but just to say that tensions were building up, and now we are here. It's been more than a year with the conflict. What's your take on that? What's your take on the war? Briefly, like superficially, let's start.
Well, first, if you were to go to MGIMO and so on, they would tell you the conflict really started was it 2006, the Orange Revolution within Kiev. So they draw even farther back to that. I would say in general, my opinion on the conflict is that Russia's quite clearly the aggressor, despite all of the claims that Putin makes and so on towards Ukrainian territory, Ukrainian history, and so on. And none of it is a right to invade another nation as they have done. Um, it's more it's a long drawn out dispute that goes back for some time, and they just abandoned the diplomatic path and have just resorted to armed force, as you see with the annexation of Crimea and now the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, which has turned into a bloody war in eastern Ukraine. There's other diplomatic elements to it that does create a quite complex picture within Ukraine. You have the Minsk agreements and so on. So there has been attempts for peace, but they have all at some point or another failed, but it still doesn't give any justification for just blatant invasion.
Do you feel that the United States has a role in it, as a lot of Russian propaganda, I dare say, claims that it's our fault, it's America's fault that there is this conflict, and America has been pushing, and NATO certainly has been pushing. So in other words, how do you see the role of the West, who doesn't really necessarily suffer casualties, but appears to be on the minds of Russians?
Yeah, Russia loves to say that NATO caused this, NATO meddling caused this, but at the same time, you could also say that Russian meddling caused this. I mean, the peak event of the entire conflict is Euromaidan, where Ukraine sits with a deal from Russia and a deal from the West, and the president at the time rejects the deal from the West, which causes a revolution. And Russians view this as Western meddling that overthrew a democratically elected government is the Russian narrative, but at the same time, the Ukrainians still made their choice. They still decided to go for the West. And the idea or the West sending arms and tanks and so on to help the Ukrainians is simply without them, the Ukrainians would have lost by now. The Ukrainians don't have a military industrial complex. They don't have a well-developed military like the West. So if the West is willing to help democracy, then of course they have to send tanks. And then in regard to the US's direct role is post World War II, the US has always assumed the position of guarantor of European security. In this role, the US is forced into helping Ukraine or picking a side or seeking some form of action within the war because we guarantee the security of the European continent. On top of this, you can listen to for the past so many years, the Germans and the French have always been saying, well, Europe can go its own way. It can go a third wheel. It can stand alone. It doesn't need the US. This war showed that Europe does need the US to help guarantee security. The Europeans were, I won't say caught with their pants down, but this was, without the US, it would have been a bigger disaster than it was. So whether the US had a direct hand in meddling and stuff like that, it's hard to say. I know there's always claims over Victoria Nuland was supporting the Maidan group to destabilize Ukraine so that way it would come towards the West. But at the base, you still do have Ukrainians who want to be part of the West. I think it's more that the nation itself does have a divide in it. It's not as united as maybe Western media would like to say. And this divide has just simply led to the conflict.
Well, clearly, the eastern parts of Ukraine that now Russia claims as their own, Donbass and Lugansk, all those areas, Crimea being disputed and finally annexated by Russia, those would be leaning more towards Russia, and the West, around the Carpat Mountains, the Carpathian in English, the Karpat region and Lviv, for example, those territories would be looking at the West, because traditionally, I believe that the culture is very strongly influenced by Western cultures, Western nations. There always has been the synergy. And I think if there was ever a cultural conflict between Ukraine and Russia, the unlikely conflict would have been around along those lines, who's more Western and who's more Eastern Slavic. I think those were some of the tensions that existed as far as I can remember. But now you mentioned Euromaidan and you explained it a little bit, but let's just give a little bit more. So that was the uprising, that was the gathering of people. They also call it Maidan, just Maidan.
Mm-hmm.
But the question is about Europe. Some of the population of Ukraine, especially the intellectuals, wanted to join the West, seeing more resources, seeing more support and more similarity. Whereas, as you mentioned, it's not such a monolithic thing to be leaning to the West. Others might realize that Russia is the biggest neighbor, and it is it represents a strong gravitational pull towards Eastern European countries. And so what happened there? Euromaidan, people stood up and decided to go west, to join the West, apply to join NATO and the European Union. And where does
Yeah,
now?
yeah. But it should be noted with the Euromaidan is that while we do focus on the pro-European protests that occurred, there was also pro-Russian protests that occurred, specifically in Odessa and then in the conflict areas of Luhansk and Donetsk. So it was more, they had the two deals and the pro-West side won out because they focused on Kiev or they simply had more support. But there was also there was a pro-Russia revolt that also occurred at the same time, which just seems to indicate the divided nature of Ukraine.
How do you think the role of Russian President Vladimir Putin, his persona, his leadership, influences everything? Well, not to mention that, of course, as the country's leader, he was the one who initiated the political process leading to the conflict. But his role in general as an inspiration, how do you see him?
How do I understand Putin, or how do I understand Putin in regard towards Ukraine?
In regards to the conflict, naturally, to Ukraine, yeah. And then maybe we can talk about him as a leader as well.
The biggest problem with Putin himself, and it goes directly to his character, is he's so hard to read. He's relatively enigma. He's a typical leader that you would expect in Russia, in that he is the persona of a strong man. The classic Russian thing is something goes wrong, they send some big name person down to come look at the problem, even though the guy clearly knows nothing about the problem. But it's always the idea of the big strong man in charge of the nation knows everything, so send him down to come look at it or tell him about it and it'll all be fine. I would say I in regard to Ukraine, I think there was genuine efforts from both sides to create peace with the Minsk Accords, or some form of stability with the Minsk Accords. I guess the problem is I would say in general he would be the reason for the invasion, and it was a rash decision on his part. But at the same time, you always hear reports of because he's so isolated as the strongman of Russia, he has the Security Council and so on. To what extent was he very aware of the situation itself? Or was he being lied to and said, oh, the pro-Russia will stage a revolt as soon as the Russian troops walk in, they're waiting for us. So, I mean, he could have allowed the invasion under completely false information because he's such an isolated individual as the top of the Russian power chain.
And what do you think is the situation with media, speaking of information and getting the right types of information? Has the media changed in and around Russia?
Oh, absolutely. So it used to be your main forms of media were the pro-government, and then you were allowed some liberal sources that did not overly criticize the government, but they still brought up issues and had a more critical tone in general. Now it's these sources are largely gone. The people who ran them, the pro-liberal, pro-Westerner, just in general pro-democratic journalists, they're all either fled or in jail or drafted. And so it's become more of a kind of echo chamber of just pro-government repetition. Although you see it in regard to the war, is Telegram is kind of, if Russia wants a very tight control of the media, Telegram, the application Telegram has presented a very large challenge to them. You see it with Telegram war bloggers that are constantly posting about Russia losses, setbacks, and then gains and so on. But it breaks the tight control they have around information.
There is a strong exodus from Russia towards neutral countries, including Armenia. I would say among those countries are Kazakhstan and some other Central Asian republics, former Soviet republics, that are neither opposed nor completely with Russia. So people leave their country, the Russians, especially those with connections to those republics, they just leave Moscow, leave Russia, and go stay in Armenia. And so Telegram has been one of the channels where those people kept in touch, and you can read, how they're settling very quickly. They start new lives. They start new jobs, new lives, and a lot of them are able to work remotely. So there is a completely different economic and social picture happening on the outskirts of the former Soviet Union. But I wanted to go back to Putin's role and his labeling of the war as a special military operation, because that's how he communicated through media, that it needs to be called special operation. Anyone calling it a war would go to jail. So that speaks of very tight control of political communication. And on a certain level, it is quite understandable. Don't you agree that if you're at war, you need to maintain some sort of a, of
Yeah,
your
but there's still a certain irony to it of you're at war, so you need censorship of the media for tight control. So there's no mass hysteria breaks out, but at the same time they have tight control but refuse to recognize it as a war. They say it's just a little operation in Ukraine. Even though now after the draft everyone recognizes it for what it is, that is a war.
It's a year and a half now. It's soon to be a year and a half, and there is no end. It seems that the end isn't near. But many leaders have declared that they would conduct a blitz war. Aside from the United States, I haven't really read or seen anything materializing as a very quick war. I don't think it's such an easy task.
Yeah, Ukraine has their counteroffensive that they're engaging in right now, and there was all the hopes that it would be a blitzkrieg, and they would, similar to like what happened in Kharkiv, they would quickly retake a lot of territory and Russian forces would crumble, but it appears it's not going the way everyone had hoped. Although I do believe that the US was far more skeptical about the possibilities of the counteroffensive. I think the US was one of the few that said there would just be marginal gains. Don't expect them to rapidly retake everything. And there is a certain delusion within if you pay attention to the Western media of, we sent 300 Western tanks and somehow that was expected to just rapidly win the war. It's the Russians are dug in. They've had time to prepare their defenses. This thing will go on for quite some time unless there's a peace deal that's negotiated.
Yeah, that would be the most desirable outcome, but I don't see that on the horizon at the moment. And speaking of aiding Ukrainians and Russia not being so prepared? You mentioned the military-industrial complex at the beginning of our conversation. Do you think that Russia's armory is getting old? Do you think that they're relying on mercenaries too much? How do you evaluate, like, from what you've heard or seen, how is Russia doing militarily?
Hard for me to say as simply a civilian without access to any documents and intel on it. But no, I would think they would do. I think they would be doing fine. If you're looking at it from the position of Ukraine, you have a long protracted war and you're going against one of the top economies in the world with a decent industrial base. If Russia switches to a wartime economy, it should be no issue for them, and they still have a strong industrial base to constantly produce the weapons they need. Their issue, apparently, according to what I see, is that they can't get semiconductors and so forth, and they're using China to get around sanctions. But I would guess the Russians are doing fine. There's nothing that would make you think they just magically run out of tanks when you're dealing with an economy the size of Russia's. And
So,
then when it comes to it, based on history, when it comes to it, the Russians are quite good at just creating cheap weapons and turning out a lot of them and eventually winning. They're
yeah,
very okay with that.
it seems like the two systems are different in their ownership model. The Russian military-industrial complex is owned by the state, and it doesn't allow alternatives, as you mentioned in one of our earlier conversations, whereas the West might be interested in refreshing the arsenal, sending older equipment, older tanks and such, to get them out of the way so that the new technologies should begin appearing. The last thing I wanted to discuss before we run out of our time, how do you think the Wagner Group will or will not change the course of the conflict? The latest episode with Wagner, I remember you talked about it. You and I talked about Wagner, and then it happened. So how can we summarize it for our audience?
The basis of the Wagner dispute is the fact that Shoigu, who's the Minister of Defense, and then the Chief of Staff, Gerasimov, something like that, I forget his exact name, had a long-standing feud with Prigozhin, the head of Wagner. And so Prigozhin claims that they used the military to attack Wagner and that he did his little march of justice for 2 or 3 days and turned around after Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, negotiated some form of settlement. And now Wagner's in Belarus. No one really knows what their next move is. They're there. They posted some video apparently of them training with the Belarusian special forces in the Belarusian military, but no one has any idea what's going to be next for them. They still have several projects in Africa.
Being mercenaries. But didn't they take a city, one of the Russian cities?
Yeah, Rostov-on-Don is where they headquartered themselves.
And so does this represent a crack in the solid propaganda face, the facade of Russia's war, or just an incident that will go away?
I think it's just a mercenary incident that will just go away. Nothing more, nothing less.
Okay, so before we run out of our 30 minutes given to us by Zoom, we have about 9 minutes. We can just wrap up and talk about what the future holds. First of all, should we be worried? Should we be worried about nuclear escalation?
Russia threatens it all the time, but I personally am not worried about it at all. I guess it's something that if you worry about it, what can you actually do? If it happens, you're gone anyway, so there's just no reason to worry.
Very interesting philosophical position, but some people argue that if Putin had intended, or if his generals had indeed intended to deploy nuclear weapons, it would have already happened. This far into the war,
probably.
Although there's never any proof, any evidence about the contrary. But aside from not worrying about being evaporated one day. What can people do? What can ordinary people do to, first of all, understand the conflict and then to live with it?
To understand the conflict, obviously, to read the history of the conflict, but try to read both sides' version of the stories so you get a more uniform view. To
There
live
are,
with it,
Mhm.
as Americans, if you ignore it, life goes on. This really does not affect us.
There are a lot of Russians living among us, and a lot of them are feeling the anxiety that drives them to display Ukrainian flags, and when you see a Ukrainian flag decorating a house in America, in upstate New York, in a big city, you think that a Ukrainian family lives there, or like it's the case with many of my friends, and actually the friend who was the first one to be interviewed on this program, one of the first people I interviewed, Anna Stepanova, they display a Ukrainian flag on their house in Baltimore, Maryland, just to show their solidarity with Ukraine because they're ethnic Russians, they're 100% Russians, and they don't want to be judged. Because one of my colleagues, she complained that her house was vandalized a little bit, significantly, if you want to know. For a person who needs to take care of an outside wall, it was just unjustified because people who did that, they didn't know the views of the owner of the house. So we live among Russians, and you know that Russian intellectuals spoke up against the war, and they said that it's damaging Russia's reputation. It's a long-standing, cultural asset for the whole world. Russia has contributed so much to the world, and now to turn into an enemy, it's just unfair to the people of Russia. So how do you have Russian friends around here?
No, I know two Russian friends who live in New York City, but beyond that, no. Most of my Russian friends either reside in Russia or Europe. Quite a
Okay,
few are in Germany. Yeah, but most are just in Russia. And I avoid discussing the war with them. It's just too sensitive for because their nation's directly involved in it, and they're far more affected by it than any American ever will be.
just how in our local politics, in our internal matters politics, we learn. I think we're learning not to bring up politics in everyday conversations, not to create a rift among people. And the same way, we need to be careful how we talk to others because people's views may be different, and we don't want to create hostility. But do you plan on going back to Russia at some point?
I personally don't plan to go back until maybe 5, 10 years from now. It's just that I was tired of it. It was time to move on, and I will wait for things to settle down with the current political situation before I consider going back.
And what do you plan to study and research in your program at Cornell?
It's for global development, so I would probably, if I get the chance, focus on small medium enterprise development, ideally in Central Asia, which is becoming a important global market as China pushes their One Belt, One Road initiative. So I would focus on that if I get the chance to.
Okay. Well, any closing thoughts? Anything you want to say before we say our goodbyes?
Thank you for having me on the program, Dr. Jerosian.
Thank you, William. And I'm sorry if I just asked questions as they as they came to my
No,
mind.
it's totally fine.
As you understand, this will not be edited heavily. If we have to cut up a little bit, we will. But otherwise, I think this is just a natural, intact conversation between a Russia expert, young scholar, William Leahy, who went to SUNY Oneonta and I would love to say that you were my student. We studied Russian together, and I learned from you how to absorb a language, how to go with grammar. You taught me a lot of things, and I hope you learned some things while you were here. I wish you all the best in your studies at Cornell University, and maybe someday we'll have you back and you can talk about peace. So this will be War and Peace.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Have a
you.
nice day.
You too. Take care. Bye bye.
Bye.